30 years ago, representatives from 179 nations gathered in Cairo for the International Conference on Population and Development, or ICPD. The commitments that resulted from this conference were groundbreaking in asserting that empowering women and girls was both the right thing to do, as well as one of the most reliable pathways to sustainable development. ICPD is best remembered today for its groundbreaking consensus on reproductive autonomy, the idea that every person has the right to freely and responsibly determine the number, timing, and spacing of pregnancies, and that we all deserve access to the information and services that enable us to make those choices. ICPD also showed many of the ways that individual rights add up to population-level trends that have important implications for development. ICPD had meaningful things to say about economic growth, the environment, migration, the rights of Indigenous people. It foreshadowed growing complexities in information, education, and communication strategies for reproductive health and rights. And critically, the framers outlined clear responsibilities for governments and donors in investing in meeting people's reproductive health needs. The Population Institute invited thought leaders to reflect on these ideas from the 1994 agreement, to assess where we are today, to explore how well we are doing our job, and what more is needed to achieve the ICPD's vision of a sustainable future that leaves no one behind. Jotham, you participated in the 1994 conference in Cairo. From your perspective, what did you think was most groundbreaking about the conference's outcomes?
The most important thing from the Cairo conference was that the UN family, the countries of the global community, came out with a strong consensus that addressing population issues meant addressing the well-being, the health, and the rights of women and girls.
What elements do you think are missing today in discussions around the demographic dividend?
In terms of the demographic dividend, a number of countries think that population growth alone is sufficient for harnessing the demographic dividend. But in actual fact, the demographic dividend is not automatic. It requires that country leadership take deliberate policies to address the youth and their concerns, to make sure that they educate them, they give them skills, they make sure that there are policies which bring in jobs and employment so that the young people can get gainful employment and improve on their economies, as well as investing in the economies. Only that way will developing countries achieve the demographic dividend.
Nandita, the ICPD is well known for its affirmation of reproductive autonomy. What do you see as new and emerging threats to reproductive autonomy today?
What we're beginning to see in the last 30, 40, 50 years, as the fertility rates have been declining in so many countries as a direct result of greater gender equality and greater reproductive autonomy, and women and girls being able to choose their paths and being able to decide on their family size, we are seeing reactionary response from governments who are trumpeting this kind of baby bust alarmism or fertility decline panic. And we have to recognize that this is actually a reactionary response of pronatalism. And that pronatalism has been around for millennia. And because, when population rates are declining in some places, it presents a threat to a lot of the institutions that depend on population growth. So I would say that we have to recognize that these are reactions to something that has been ever present and pervasive.
Celine, the ICPD outlined the need for harmonious, dynamic balance in the interrelationships between population, resources, the environment, and development. In the past 30 years, how has the need for this balance come into even sharper focus?
The global population has increased significantly. In 1994, there were 5.4 billion humans on the planet. And in 2024, we're now at 8.2 billion humans. That's a difference of over 2.5 billion humans, which was the entire size of the human population in the 1950s. So we've been seeing a rise in resource extraction, for example, which has tripled since the 1970s. We also see the impact that human activities has on other species, which we refer to today as the sixth mass extinction because of its unprecedented scale. So we are overall today as a species demanding more of the biosphere than it can sustainably provide for us. This is an environmental crisis, but it's also a crisis of equity and a crisis of justice, because some population groups, the more vulnerable population groups, are going to be experiencing the harms of environmental degradation disproportionately. It's also an intergenerational crisis because we're endangering the future. And lastly, it's an existential crisis as we are destroying the conditions that enable us to flourish as a species. So as we look forward beyond ICPD 30, we need to kind of go back to this vision and truly integrate population dynamics and environmental sustainability into the reproductive rights ideological and programmatic framework. So doing this also represents an opportunity to strengthen reproductive rights by unlocking new funding sources, for example, as well as appealing to a new spectrum of donors and champions. Reproductive health and family planning services can be included in climate adaptation and resilience solutions, for example, as well as in biodiversity programs. So we really need to both think of eliminating unsustainable patterns of production and consumption, which are driving our environmental crisis, but we also need to bring back population policies into our reproductive health and rights thinking.
Araceli, what stands out to you about the way ICPD framed the issue of international migration?
Well, I think that ICPD contributes in establishing guidelines that consider the balance between migrating and staying to approach migration as a human rights issue. It also contributes to start the discussion on the benefits for both destination and origin countries. But for Central America, we require a focus on structural conditions. I think that besides corruption, inequality, poverty, our region is extremely vulnerable to climate change and disasters. And we need to address that urgently because there cannot be a voluntary migration if people are forced to leave because there are no opportunities. And the only way to migrate is under irregular pathways.
Kelly, what was notable to you in the way the ICPD addressed issues of concern for Indigenous people?
ICPD addressed the intersectional nature of Indigenous worldviews about population and development. We as Indigenous peoples have experienced population, land, and cultural loss, as well as damage to our Mother Earth in the form of environmental degradation. Violence against women, often at the hands of non-Indigenous men, continues to be prevalent. The accumulation of these losses over generations, coupled with modern structural racism and sexism, leads to feelings of isolation and depression, which is fueling a mental and physical health crisis among Indigenous people, especially women and girls. When colonial settlers came upon our lands, we exchanged them for guarantees of basic health, housing, income, and education in the form of treaties with the U.S. government. These trust responsibilities by the U.S. government, however, have not always been upheld, leading to severe underfunding of Indian health service providers that give services in exchange for the lands that we gave up. Moreover, health systems serving Native peoples are often hobbled by laws limiting women's control over their bodies. Indigenous-led approaches to gender transformative health and justice can best address challenges that Indigenous communities face.
So the information, education, and communications landscape has changed a lot in the last 30 years. Do you feel like entertainment media is still an impactful intervention?
Even more so because people consume so much more media. The demographic and health surveys over several decades have shown that the top reasons given by people for non-use of contraception among people who don't want to be pregnant is fear of health effects, and particularly misinformation about safety and effectiveness, plus male opposition and religious opposition. And the program of action recognized that people are not going home at night to listen to documentaries or to consume public health messages, and put emphasis on the use of entertainment mass media for changing norms and for helping people understand the benefits of things like use of family planning, child spacing, smaller family norms.
Joe, throughout your career, you've done a lot of work to advance the idea of universal access to family planning and reproductive health services. Why was ICPD so important when it came to questions of financing family planning and reproductive health?
Well, the 179 delegates to the Cairo conference set goals for funding family planning, reproductive health, and HIV/AIDS, and agreed that development assistance donors would pay at least 1/3 of the costs. The UN estimates that there are still 190 million women in low and middle income countries who want to limit childbearing, but are not using contraception. A major reason for this shortfall in use is the lack of funds for family planning and reproductive health programs. One estimate is that about $12 billion a year is needed to support family planning in low and middle income countries, but only $7 billion is available. So there's a $5 billion funding gap. If donors lived up to their pledge and provided 1/3 of the $12 billion, they should be contributing $4 billion a year, but they're only providing $1.35 billion. And the US contribution has been stuck at about $600 million a year for the past 14 years, far short of their fair share of $1.7 billion a year.
An important thread in this story is that advancing and defending individual rights is meaningful, both to the individual and because advancing rights shapes trends at the population level. Indeed, a population lens helps us better understand where inequities exist and persist in society. And a population lens can help us prioritize investments for a future that we all want. Of course, when we analyze population trends, we look at numbers, but ICPD reminds us that behind every number is a person with hopes for their future, a person deserving of respect for their rights and the ability to pursue opportunities in life. When it comes to achieving the ICPD's vision of a sustainable future that leaves no one behind, the job is not yet done.
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 The job is not yet done.